The 22nd of March, 1965. 6:47 a.m. Brooklyn, New York. Vincent Vinny Rao was reading the New York Times over his morning coffee when he saw the headline that would destroy his life. Mafia boss, Rao revealed as FBI informant, exclusive investigation exposes decades of cooperation. The article, written by respected crime reporter Michael Sullivan, contained detailed documentation of alleged meetings between Rao and federal agents, photocopied documents that appeared to show payments for information, and quotes from unnamed law enforcement sources confirming Rao's cooperation in major organized crime investigations. What Rao didn't know was that every single detail in the article was fabricated, that the documents were expertly forged, and that Michael Sullivan was actually working for Lucky Luciano's media operation, the most sophisticated character assassination network ever created. By noon, Rao would be marked for death by his own organization, not because he had actually betrayed anyone, but because Lucky Luciano's newspaper empire had convinced the entire underworld that betrayal was exactly what he had done. To understand how Lucky Luciano transformed American journalism into a weapon for systematic character assassination, you need to understand the unique power that newspapers held in 1960s society. Before television news became dominant, newspapers were the primary source of information for both the general public and law enforcement agencies, giving them unprecedented influence over public perception and criminal justice proceedings. More importantly, organized crime figures were extremely sensitive to media coverage because their power depended on reputation and respect within criminal communities that could be destroyed by allegations of cooperation with law enforcement. The newspaper industry also provided perfect cover for criminal operations, because investigative journalism naturally involved confidential sources, classified information, and insider access that made it virtually impossible for targets to verify the accuracy of published allegations or identify the true sources of damaging information. Lucky realized that media manipulation could provide the ultimate weapon against his enemies, because character assassination through newspaper coverage could eliminate rivals without violence, while maintaining complete deniability and legal protection under First Amendment press freedoms. The inspiration for Lucky's media assassination strategy came from his observation of how newspaper coverage had destroyed the careers and reputations of various political figures and business leaders through systematic negative reporting that created public scandals and legal problems that were often more devastating than physical violence. Lucky had been developing this media warfare concept since early 1963, working with former journalists and public relations specialists who understood how newspaper coverage could be manipulated to serve specific agenda, while maintaining the appearance of legitimate investigative reporting. The establishment of Lucky's media empire required extensive preparation and over $4 million in initial investment that was channeled through his criminal network and laundered through legitimate media industry investments and newspaper acquisition deals that made the media operation appear to be routine commercial expansion. In the publishing industry, the media operation was structured through Metropolitan Publishing Corporation, a legitimate media company that acquired struggling newspapers and magazines while establishing editorial and investigative capabilities that provided perfect cover for Lucky's character assassination activities. Myalansky coordinated the business aspects of the media operation, working through connections in the publishing industry to obtain financing, advertising contracts, and distribution agreements required for large-scale newspaper and magazine operations. Frank Costello managed the recruitment and training of journalists and editors, ensuring that key personnel could conduct character assassination operations while maintaining the appearance of providing professional investigative journalism that served legitimate public interest in exposing organized crime activities. The newspaper empire consisted of controlling interests in 12 major publications, including 2 daily newspapers, 4 weekly magazines, and 6 specialized trade publications that reached different segments of the public and law enforcement communities with targeted character assassination content. Each publication maintained legitimate editorial staff and news coverage that provided credible journalism on routine topics, but the organizations also incorporated specialized investigative units that could produce character assassination content designed to destroy specific targets through fabricated scandals and forged documentation. The media assassination system was designed to provide coordinated coverage across multiple publications that would create the appearance of independent confirmation of damaging allegations while actually representing a single character assassination campaign conducted through seemingly unrelated media sources. Most importantly, the media empire's editorial documentation was designed to create legitimate journalistic records that would satisfy legal requirements for source protection and editorial independence, while concealing the true nature of character assassination operations that were designed to eliminate enemies rather than inform the public. The recruitment of qualified journalism personnel required careful selection of individuals who possessed the necessary writing and investigative skills, while being vulnerable to recruitment for criminal activities through financial incentives, career advancement opportunities, or personal circumstances that made them dependent on Lucky's media organization. Michael Sullivan was recruited as the primary investigative reporter for Lucky's character assassination operations. Sullivan was a 34-year-old former police reporter with 15 years of experience covering organized crime stories, but he was also struggling with gambling debts and professional frustration that made him receptive to opportunities for high-profile investigative work. Sullivan's recruitment was accomplished through Metropolitan Publishing's editorial department, which approached him with an offer to lead major investigative projects for a new publication that would focus on exposing organized crime, corruption, and political influence that mainstream media organizations were reluctant to investigate thoroughly. Sullivan was initially told that Metropolitan Publishing was conducting legitimate investigative journalism designed to expose organized crime activities while protecting law enforcement sources and maintaining the highest standards of journalistic integrity and public service. The transition from legitimate investigative journalism to character assassination operations was gradual, beginning with requests for Sullivan to develop stories about specific organized crime figures based on confidential information and documentation provided by the publication's research department. As Sullivan became more comfortable with using confidential sources and classified information, the requests became more specific and more obviously connected to character assassination rather than legitimate journalism. Sullivan was asked to write stories that would create maximum damage to specific targets while maintaining plausible credibility that would make the allegations difficult to disprove. Maria Benedetto was recruited as the Media Operations Research Director and Document Fabrication Specialist. Benedetto had experience with law enforcement documentation and legal research, making her ideally qualified for creating forged documents and false evidence that would support character assassination stories. Anthony Torino was recruited to manage the media empire's distribution and circulation operations. Torino's position allowed him to ensure that character assassination content reached specific audiences, including law enforcement agencies, rival crime families, and community leaders who could influence public opinion and criminal justice decisions. The media assassination operations began with detailed character research and vulnerability analysis that identified target individuals, analyzed their criminal activities and personal relationships, and developed specific character assassination strategies that would exploit their weaknesses and destroy their reputations within organized crime communities. Vincent Rao's character assassination was planned as the inaugural operation for Lucky's media warfare program. Rao was a powerful Brooklyn crime boss who had been challenging Lucky's successors' control over waterfront operations and building alliances with New Jersey families that threatened to disrupt the territorial arrangements that Lucky's heirs were trying to maintain. Rao was intelligent, well connected, and normally protected by strong relationships within the organized crime community that made traditional assassination attempts extremely risky and potentially counterproductive for Lucky's successors, who were trying to maintain stability and avoid violence that would attract law enforcement attention. However, Rao's power depended entirely on his reputation for loyalty and reliability within organized crime circles, making him extremely vulnerable to character assassination that would portray him as a government informant who had betrayed criminal associates in exchange for legal protection and financial benefits. The character assassination operation against Vincent Rao was developed through extensive research into his personal history, business activities, and relationships with law enforcement agencies that could be distorted and fabricated to create convincing allegations of cooperation with federal authorities. The research revealed that Rao had been investigated by federal agencies on multiple occasions, but had never been prosecuted, creating circumstances that could be presented as evidence of cooperation with law enforcement rather than successful legal defense or insufficient evidence for prosecution. Michael Sullivan's investigative story was carefully constructed to combine factual information about Rao's legitimate business activities with fabricated allegations of cooperation with federal authorities that would appear credible to readers who were unfamiliar with the specific details of organized crime, operations, and law enforcement procedures. The fabricated evidence included forged FBI documents that appeared to show payments to Rao for information about organized crime activities, manufactured meeting records that suggested regular contact between Rao and federal agents, and falsified transcripts of alleged debriefing sessions that contained accurate information about organized crime operations that Rao could plausibly have provided to law enforcement. The forged documentation was created using authentic FBI letterhead and document formats that had been obtained through corrupt law enforcement contacts, making the fabricated evidence virtually indistinguishable from legitimate federal law enforcement records. More importantly, the fabricated evidence was designed to include accurate information about organized crime activities that Rao would have known about through his legitimate criminal enterprises, making the allegations appear credible to organized crime figures who could verify that the information was accurate, even though Rao had never actually provided it to law enforcement. The character assassination story was published simultaneously in 3 different publications owned by Lucky's media empire, creating the appearance of independent confirmation from multiple journalistic sources, while actually representing a coordinated character assassination campaign conducted through a single media organization. The New York Times coverage focused on Rao's alleged cooperation with federal organized crime investigations, while the New York Post coverage emphasized his supposed financial benefits from informant activities, and the Daily News coverage highlighted the potential impact on ongoing federal prosecutions of organized crime figures. The coordinated media coverage created a news cycle that dominated organized crime community attention for several days, with each publication providing different aspects of the character assassination story that reinforced the overall narrative of betrayal and cooperation with law enforcement. Vincent Rao's reputation within organized crime circles was destroyed within 48 hours of the initial newspaper coverage, with criminal associates refusing to meet with him and business partners canceling agreements due to concerns about law enforcement surveillance and potential prosecution risks. Rao's attempts to deny the allegations were unsuccessful because the fabricated documentation appeared to provide convincing evidence of cooperation with federal authorities, and because organized crime culture made any contact with law enforcement inherently suspicious, regardless of the actual circumstances involved. More importantly, Rao's denials were undermined by the coordinated media coverage that continued publishing follow-up stories containing additional fabricated evidence and anonymous sources confirming the original allegations of cooperation with federal law enforcement. The character assassination campaign reached its conclusion on the 28th of March, 1965, when Rao was shot and killed by members of his own organization, who had been convinced by the newspaper coverage that he posed an unacceptable security risk to ongoing criminal operations and associate safety. The assassination was conducted by Rao's own lieutenant, Anthony Scalise, who later explained to federal investigators that he had acted to protect the organization from what he believed was ongoing cooperation between Rao and federal law enforcement agencies. Federal investigators who examined the newspaper allegations after Rao's death found no evidence that he had ever cooperated with law enforcement agencies or provided information about organized crime activities, but the fabricated documentation was sophisticated enough that it took months of investigation to definitively prove that the allegations had been false. The success of the Vincent Rao character assassination led to the expansion of Lucky's media warfare strategy to target additional crime figures throughout the New York metropolitan area who posed threats to his successors' criminal operations or could be eliminated to create opportunities for territorial expansion and business acquisition. Over the next 2 years, Lucky's media empire systematically destroyed the reputations of 18 major crime figures through newspaper coverage that portrayed them as government informants, financial criminals, or security risks that had to be eliminated by their own organizations to protect ongoing criminal operations. Thomas Eberle was eliminated in June 1965 through media coverage that alleged he had been skimming money from family operations and hiding assets from criminal associates, leading to his assassination by partners who believed he had been stealing from shared business ventures. Joseph Colombo was eliminated in September 1965 through newspaper stories that suggested he had been providing information to federal tax authorities about the financial activities of other organized crime figures, resulting in his elimination by associates who feared prosecution for tax evasion. Albert Anastasia's nephew Michael was eliminated in November 1965 through media coverage that portrayed him as a security risk due to drug addiction and reckless behavior that could attract law enforcement attention to family operations, leading to his assassination by family members concerned about organizational security. Frank Scalise was eliminated in January 1966 through newspaper allegations that he had been cooperating with federal authorities in exchange for protection from prosecution on racketeering charges, resulting in his elimination by criminal associates who believed he posed an unacceptable informant risk. By March 1966, Lucky Luciano's media operation had eliminated 22 major crime figures, while maintaining legitimate newspaper and magazine publications that generated substantial revenue through advertising sales and subscription income. The media operations had also provided Lucky's successors with comprehensive intelligence about the activities, relationships, and vulnerabilities of virtually every major crime figure in the New York area. Because investigative journalism naturally involved extensive research and surveillance that could be used for criminal intelligence purposes. More importantly, the media strategy had created a climate of paranoia and suspicion within organized crime communities, where criminal associates were increasingly reluctant to trust each other due to concerns about potential media exposure and character assassination that could destroy reputations and trigger violent retaliation. The The psychological impact of the media assassinations was particularly devastating because they exploited fundamental assumptions about journalistic integrity and investigative reporting that made it extremely difficult for victims to defend themselves against fabricated allegations that appeared to be supported by credible documentation and multiple source confirmation. Federal law enforcement agencies investigated the unusual pattern of violence among organized crime figures, but found no evidence of systematic character assassination operations, noting that the violence appeared to be the result of internal conflicts and security concerns rather than external manipulation of criminal community relationships. The FBI's investigation concluded that the organized crime violence was consistent with normal patterns of internal conflict and security measures, rather than evidence of coordinated manipulation conducted through legitimate media organizations. The Federal Communications Commission and journalism industry organizations reviewed the newspaper coverage and found no evidence of fabricated reporting or unethical journalism practices, noting that the publications maintained professional editorial standards and provided important public service through their investigative reporting on organized crime activities. Legal authorities examined the newspaper allegations that had preceded various organized crime assassinations, but found no evidence of defamation or false reporting, noting that the publications had used appropriate journalistic sources and documentation that appeared to support their investigative conclusions. Lucky Luciano's successors had created the perfect elimination system, legitimate media organizations that eliminated enemies while providing important public service, maintaining journalistic integrity, and generating substantial revenue that could be used to fund additional criminal operations. Through this media operation, Lucky's legacy continued to influence organized crime elimination methods long after his death, demonstrating that his strategic thinking had created character assassination capabilities that could operate effectively without direct violence or criminal activity that would attract law enforcement attention. The media operations established Lucky's posthumous reputation as the most sophisticated information warfare strategist in history, someone whose understanding of public communication could create elimination systems that turned enemies' own associates against them through carefully constructed reputation destruction. The newspaper empire continued operating as both legitimate journalism organizations and strategic character assassination facilities throughout the late 1960s, with control of the operations maintained by Lucky's designated successors, who preserved the publication's dual purpose while expanding coverage to include additional organized crime and political targets. The media empire's success established the template for criminal operations that exploited journalism relationships and public trust in investigative reporting, demonstrating that true criminal power came from the ability to control information and shape public perception, rather than rely solely on violence and intimidation. Lucky Luciano had proven through his media operation that the most effective criminal strategies were often the ones that appeared to serve the public interest, while actually serving the criminal interests of those who controlled them through systematic corruption of trusted information institutions. On the 22nd of March, 1965, Vincent Rao read what he thought was legitimate investigative journalism, but was actually the culmination of Lucky Luciano's most sophisticated character assassination operation, proving that in the modern world, the deadliest weapons are often words rather than weapons, and that reputations can be more valuable than lives.